Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Cities, farms, mountains, deserts. We've built skyscrapers, sent rockets to Mars, and created the internet. We dominate this planet like no species ever has. But if you had traveled back 900,000 years ago, you would have found a world where humanity barely existed at all. Just 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across an entire continent. Not 12 million, not 128,000, 1,280 people. That's smaller than most high schools. The entire future of our species balanced on a group so small they could have fit into a single camping ground. If you're here to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Hit subscribe if this helps you drift off, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I love reading the comments. Someone in Tokyo watching sunrise, another in Chicago settling in with snow falling outside, all of us connected by this same impossible story. You know that moment when you realize how close you came to missing something life-changing? Like when you almost didn't go to that party where you met your best friend, or nearly skipped the class that changed your career. That's what happened to our entire species, except the stakes were existence itself. For over 100,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history, humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. One bad decade, one volcanic winter, one shift in climate could have ended the story before it really began. And here's the mind-bending part. We only discovered this happened 2 years ago. Scientists had always suspected humans went through some kind of population crash deep in our past. Our genetic diversity is strangely low compared to other species. Chimpanzees living in small scattered groups across Africa have far more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. That's the fingerprint of a bottleneck. But nobody knew how severe it was, or how long it lasted. Nobody knew we came within a whisper of never existing at all. Now, before we dive into the science, let's get our bearings. When scientists talk about a population bottleneck, they mean something very specific, a prolonged drop in the number of individuals who are actually breeding and passing on their genes. It's not a single catastrophe that wipes out most of a species in one terrible moment. Instead, it's like a slow squeeze that lasts for thousands of generations. Think of it like an hourglass. All the sand at the top represents the human population before the bottleneck, probably tens of thousands of individuals spread across Africa and maybe into Asia. All the sand at the bottom represents us today, 8 billion people scattered across every continent. But in between, there's that narrow neck where every grain has to pass through. That's our bottleneck. 1,280 breeding individuals stretched across more than 100,000 years. The classic story goes like this. Climate change during the early to middle Pleistocene transition made life brutally difficult. Ice ages were getting longer and more severe. The world was cooling down, drying out. Forests shrank, grasslands turned to desert, reliable water sources disappeared. Small bands of early humans found themselves trapped in shrinking refugia, pockets of livable habitat surrounded by increasingly hostile terrain. But here's where the story gets more complex, more interesting. Recent genomic modeling suggests this wasn't just a climate story. It was also about population structure, about how our ancestors were organized across the landscape. They weren't one big happy family mixing freely. They were scattered into small, semi-isolated groups that might go generations without significant contact. When populations are structured like this, even if the total number of people alive is relatively large, the effective breeding population, the number that matters genetically, can be much smaller. It's like having a bunch of separate villages that rarely intermarry. Each village might be thriving, but genetically they're acting like separate species. The method that revealed this bottleneck is called fit-coal, and it's a remarkable piece of scientific detective work. Researchers took genetic data from thousands of modern humans and worked backward, using the patterns of variation they see today to infer what population sizes must have been like in the past. It's like reading the history of a tree and its rings, except instead of counting rings, they're counting mutations and measuring genetic diversity. But we need to be honest about the limitations. These models depend on assumptions about mutation rates, how often DNA changes as it passes from parent to child. They depend on estimates of generation time, how long it takes for one generation to give way to the next. They depend on assumptions about population structure and migration patterns. Change any of these assumptions and your estimates change too. That's why multiple teams are now working to verify these results using different methods, different datasets, different assumptions. Science works best when it's skeptical of its own conclusions. The exact numbers might shift as new data comes in, but the general pattern seems robust. Our ancestors went through a prolonged period of genetic constriction that left permanent signatures in our DNA. What makes this period particularly interesting is its timing. The bottleneck overlaps with some of the most severe climate conditions of the Pleistocene era. Marine isotope stage 22, roughly 870,000 to 900,000 years ago, was one of the coldest, driest periods our ancestors had ever faced. Ice sheets covered vast areas of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, deserts expanded, forest refugia shrank to tiny pockets. At the same time, volcanic activity was pumping ash and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere, creating additional cooling that could last for years after major eruptions. It was like nature was throwing everything it could at our ancestors: ice, drought, darkness, and the constant pressure of finding enough food to survive. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't just survive, they innovated. Archaeological evidence from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa shows controlled use of fire by 1 million years ago, right around the time our bottleneck was beginning. Fire meant warmth, protection from predators, the ability to cook food and extract more calories from tough plant materials. It meant light after dark, extending the usable hours of each day. The story we're going to tell tonight weaves together genetics, climate science, archaeology, and human psychology. We'll explore how those 1,280 survivors developed the survival toolkit that carried our species through its darkest hour: dietary flexibility, technological innovation, social cooperation, and an almost unimaginable persistence in the face of adversity. We'll visit the evidence, from genome sequences to archaeological sites to climate data frozen in ancient ice. We'll examine the debates. Are we overinterpreting the genetic signals? Does the fossil record support such a severe bottleneck? What can we actually know about events that happened nearly 1 million years ago? Most importantly, we'll explore why this matters for us today. The lessons learned during the Great Bottleneck about cooperation, adaptation, resilience, and hope are written into our DNA and our culture. They're part of who we are as a species. So, settle in. Let your mind wander back through the centuries, back through the millennia, back to a time when humanity hung by the thinnest of threads. The story of how we survived is also the story of how we became who we are today. And it's a story worth telling on a quiet night when the world feels uncertain, and we need reminding of just how resilient life can be. 900,000 years ago, in what would someday be called Africa, a small fire crackles against the infinite darkness. 3 adults and 2 children huddle around the flames. The night air carries the distant cough of a saber-toothed cat and the nervous lowing of antelopes somewhere beyond the circle of light. This is not a safe world. It has never been a safe world. But tonight, for this moment, 5 human beings have carved out a pocket of warmth and safety in a universe that seems designed to kill them. The mother tends the fire with practiced efficiency, feeding it precisely the right amount of dried grass and small twigs to keep the flames steady without creating too much smoke. Smoke draws attention from things better left undisturbed. She learned this from her mother, who learned it from her mother, in an unbroken chain of firekeeping that stretches back through the generations like a lifeline. Beside her, the father works by firelight, carefully chipping flakes from a piece of volcanic stone. His hands move with patient precision, each strike calculated to remove exactly the right amount of material. The tool taking shape in his hands is what archaeologists will someday call an Acheulean hand axe, a symmetrical, teardrop-shaped implement that represents one of humanity's first standardized technologies. The hand axe isn't just a tool, it's a triumph of planning and abstract thinking. To make one properly requires the ability to envision the finished product, to understand the properties of stone, to control the force and angle of each blow. It requires teaching and practice, and the kind of patience that only comes from knowing your survival depends on getting it right. The two children watch their parents work. The older child, perhaps 8 years old, tends the edges of the fire, carefully placing small sticks where the flames are beginning to die down. She has been doing this for 3 years now, ever since she was old enough to understand that fire is both life and death, that it must be fed but never overfed, maintained but never taken for granted. The younger child, barely walking, explores the edge of the firelight under watchful eyes. Everything is dangerous beyond the circle of light: predators, cliffs, poisonous plants, the simple but lethal possibility of getting lost in the darkness. But within the fire's glow, there is safety enough for a curious toddler to investigate smooth stones and dried seed pods. The third adult, the children's grandmother, prepares the evening meal. In her weathered hands, she holds several tubers, underground storage organs that she and the mother spent the afternoon digging from the hard earth. Raw, these tubers would be tough, barely digestible, potentially toxic, but fire changes everything. She places the tubers directly in the coals, where they begin to steam and soften. The heat breaks down tough fibers, neutralizes harmful compounds, and releases nutrients that raw eating could never provide. This is cooking in its most elementary form, but it represents a revolution in human nutrition. Cooked foods provide more calories per unit of energy expended in digestion. They allow smaller guts, which require less energy to maintain, freeing up metabolic resources for larger brains. The family speaks little. Language, if it exists at all in anything like the form we would recognize, is simple, functional. But they communicate constantly through glances, gestures, shared tasks. When the father completes his hand axe, he shows it to his older daughter, letting her feel its weight and balance. When the grandmother judges the tubers ready, she signals to the mother, who uses a stick to roll them from the coals. This is education, though they have no word for it. This is culture, though they have no concept of the term. This is the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge that allows a species to survive in a world that kills most of what it touches. Around them, the night sounds continue. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of spotted hyenas calls to each other. Powerful, intelligent predators perfectly adapted to scavenging and hunting in the darkness. Closer, a small owl hoots from a dead tree. Insects chirp and buzz. The night world is alive, active, dangerous. But the fire holds the danger at bay. Predators fear fire instinctively, and for good reason. It burns, it spreads, it destroys habitat, and prey alike. A group of humans with fire is not easy prey. They are something new in the world, something that can push back against the darkness with light and heat and the promise of violence. As the family shares their simple meal of cooked tubers and perhaps some meat from an earlier hunt, they embody humanity's emerging survival strategy: flexibility, cooperation, technology, and the patient accumulation of knowledge across generations. They eat what the landscape provides, but they transform it through fire and tools. They work together, sharing tasks and resources and vigilance. They teach their children not just what to do, but how to think about what to do. This scene, repeated in countless variations across the African landscape, represents the foundation of human survival during the Great Bottleneck. Not dramatic heroics or sudden innovations, but the quiet, persistent application of accumulated wisdom to the daily challenge of staying alive in a hostile world. The fire burns lower as the night deepens. The youngest child has fallen asleep against his grandmother's side. The older child banks the coals carefully, ensuring they will last until morning. The parents take turns watching and sleeping, always alert for the sounds that mean danger approaching. They are 5 people around a fire, unremarkable in most ways. They have no idea they are part of a population that has dwindled to barely more than 1,000 breeding individuals. They have no sense of the vast sweep of geological time, no understanding that they are living through one of the most severe climate crises in Earth's history. All they know is that they are alive tonight, and they intend to be alive tomorrow. The fire will burn until dawn. The tools will be ready when needed. The children will learn what they need to know, and somehow, impossibly, the human story will continue for another day. In the distance, a saber-toothed cat coughs once more and moves on, seeking easier prey. The 5 humans sleep on, tended by the dying fire, dreaming whatever dreams our ancestors dreamed when the world was young and every sunrise was a victory against extinction. Here's the astonishing claim. Nearly 1 million years ago, the genetic history of every human being alive today passed through a bottleneck so narrow that it contained only about 1,280 breeding individuals. Think of it like an hourglass lying on its side, stretching across geological time. At one end, you have the human population before the bottleneck, perhaps tens of thousands of individuals scattered across Africa and possibly into Asia. At the other end, you have us, 8 billion people spread across every continent on Earth. But connecting those two vast populations is a neck so narrow that every grain of genetic sand had to squeeze through a space barely wider than a small town. This isn't speculation. It's the result of sophisticated genomic analysis published in 2023 using a computational method called FitCol. Researchers analyzed genetic variation in thousands of modern human genomes and worked backward, reading the patterns like an ancient text written in the language of DNA. What they found was the signature of an extraordinary demographic collapse, a sustained period when our species teetered on the edge of extinction. The timeline places this bottleneck between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. That's a span of more than 100,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history, longer than our species has had agriculture, longer than we've had cities or writing or any of the things we think of as civilization. For more than 4,000 generations, humanity persisted at numbers so low that a bad decade could have ended our story forever. To understand what this means, we need to be precise about effective population size. It's not a head count of bodies. It's a measure of genetic diversity, how many individuals in a population are actually contributing their genes to the next generation. In real populations, this number is almost always smaller than the census size, sometimes dramatically so. Why? Because not everyone reproduces successfully. Some individuals die before reaching reproductive age, others survive but never find mates. Still, others have children who don't survive to reproduce themselves. And in populations that are geographically scattered or socially structured, many potential parents might live their entire lives without ever encountering suitable partners from other groups. So when we say the effective breeding population dropped to 1,280, we're not saying there were literally only 1,280 people alive in the entire world. We're saying that the genetic contribution to future generations was so constrained that it was as if only that many individuals were reproducing successfully. But even with this caveat, the numbers are staggering. Today, there are approximately 8 billion humans on Earth. During the bottleneck, the genetic effective size of our entire species was smaller than the student body of most modern high schools. Every person reading this, every face in every crowd, every human achievement and failure and dream, it all traces back through that impossibly narrow passage. The method that revealed this bottleneck is itself a marvel of modern science. FitCol analyzes what researchers call the site frequency spectrum, essentially. It looks at how common or rare different genetic variants are in modern populations. These patterns carry signatures of ancient demographic events like fossilized footprints in stone. When a population goes through a severe bottleneck, it leaves characteristic marks on genetic diversity. Rare variants become even rarer because there are fewer individuals to carry them. Common variants become more common through genetic drift. The overall level of diversity drops dramatically, and these effects persist for thousands of generations even after population sizes recover. The researchers applied this analysis to genomic data from 4,648 individuals from modern populations around the world. The signal was unmistakable, a prolonged, severe contraction in human population size beginning around 930,000 years ago and persisting until approximately 813,000 years ago. What makes this finding particularly intriguing is its timing. The inferred bottleneck coincides almost perfectly with one of the most severe climate crises of the Pleistocene era, marine isotope stage 22, a period of intense glaciation that lasted from approximately 870,000 to 900,000 years ago. This was climate change on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded human history. Ice sheets covered vast areas of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing land bridges but also creating massive deserts where shallow seas had been. Average global temperatures plummeted. Precipitation patterns shifted dramatically, turning forests into grasslands and grasslands into deserts. But climate alone might not explain such a prolonged, severe bottleneck. Other factors were likely at work. Population structure, where small groups remained isolated from each other for long periods, behavioral changes that reduced reproductive success, perhaps even genetic factors that made our ancestors more vulnerable to environmental stress. The mystery deepens when we look at the archaeological record. While we see clear evidence of climate stress during this period, we don't see obvious signs of a population collapse so severe that our species nearly went extinct. Stone tool traditions continue. Archaeological sites persist, though they may be sparser. There's continuity as well as crisis. This raises important questions about how we interpret genetic data. Are we reading the signals correctly? Could population structure or other factors create bottleneck-like patterns in genetic diversity without an actual near-extinction event? Could the models be missing something important about how our ancestors lived and reproduced? These are active areas of research and debate. Science works best when it questions its own findings, when multiple teams use different methods to test the same hypotheses. The exact depth and duration of the bottleneck may be refined as new data becomes available and new analytical methods are developed. But even if the specific numbers change, the broader pattern seems robust. Our species went through a period of severe demographic constriction that left permanent signatures in our genetics. We are all descended from a surprisingly small number of survivors who made it through one of the most challenging periods in human evolutionary history. This bottleneck didn't just shape our genetics, it shaped who we are as a species. The traits that allowed our ancestors to survive, flexibility, cooperation, innovation, persistence, are part of our inheritance. The challenges they faced and overcame are written into our DNA and our culture. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that your existence represents an unbroken chain of survival stretching back through nearly 1 million years of human history. Every ancestor whose genes you carry was a survivor, a problem solver, someone who found a way to keep going when keeping going seemed impossible. You are the descendant of the 1280 who saved humanity. The standard story begins with ice. Between 1,200,000 and 700,000 years ago, Earth's climate system underwent a fundamental shift. The transition, known to scientists as the mid-Pleistocene transition, changed the very rhythm of ice ages. Where glacial cycles had once lasted roughly 41,000 years, they now stretched to nearly 100,000 years. More importantly, the cold periods became far more severe. Picture our planet during marine isotope stage 22, roughly 870,000 to 900,000 years ago. Massive ice sheets, some over a mile thick, grind across northern Europe and North America. So much water is locked up in ice that global sea levels drop by more than 100 meters. The English Channel becomes dry land. The Mediterranean shrinks to a fraction of its current size. Land bridges emerge where ocean straits once flowed. But the ice is only part of the story. With so much water trapped in glaciers, precipitation patterns shift dramatically across the globe. Monsoon systems weaken. Rivers that had flowed for millions of years slow to seasonal trickles or disappear entirely. The Sahara Desert expands southward, pushing savanna environments toward the equator. Forests retreat to isolated refugia, small pockets of suitable habitat surrounded by increasingly hostile terrain. For small bands of early humans scattered across Africa and possibly into Asia, this climate shift represented an existential challenge. The reliable water sources their ancestors had depended on for hundreds of thousands of years began to fail. The migration routes of large herbivores, the antelopes, elephants, and other game that provided much of their protein, shifted or disappeared entirely. Plants that had provided crucial calories from nuts, seeds, and tubers became scarce or vanished from traditional gathering areas. Archaeological evidence from this period paints a picture of increasing stress. While stone tool traditions like the Acheulean continue, site densities appear to decrease in many regions. The rich, diverse assemblages of artifacts found in earlier sites become sparser, simpler. It's as if people were spending more energy on basic survival and less on technological innovation or artistic expression. The oxygen isotope record from deep-sea sediments, our best proxy for ancient global climate, shows that marine isotope stage 22 was one of the most severe glacial periods of the entire Pleistocene epoch. Ice volume reached levels not seen before or since. Global temperatures dropped to their lowest point in over 1 million years. For our ancestors, who had never experienced anything like this scale of climate crisis, the world was becoming almost unrecognizable. Add to this the effects of volcanic activity. Large eruptions during glacial periods could inject sulfur compounds into the stratosphere, creating additional cooling that persisted for years. The combination of ice age conditions and volcanic dimming could create what modern climate scientists call nuclear winter effects, sudden, severe drops in temperature and growing seasons that could devastate both plant and animal populations. Small human bands, already struggling with resource scarcity, would have faced cascading failures. When the rains failed, water sources dried up. When water sources dried up, game animals moved away or died. When game animals disappeared, people had to travel farther and take greater risks to find food. Greater risks meant higher mortality. Higher mortality, combined with the stress of chronic malnutrition, meant lower birth rates and higher infant mortality. The mathematics of small populations work against survival in harsh conditions. A group of 50 people might lose 5 or 10 individuals in a bad year and recover quickly when conditions improve. But a group of 15 or 20 people losing the same number faces potential extinction. There's a threshold below which demographic stochasticity, the random variations in birth and death rates, can drive a population extinct even in the absence of environmental catastrophe. During the worst phases of marine isotope stage 22, many local populations probably did go extinct. Small bands that had persisted in the same territories for thousands of years simply vanished, leaving no trace except perhaps a final scatter of stone tools in an abandoned campsite. The survivors would have been those groups lucky enough to be in refugia, small pockets of habitat where water remained available, where some large game persisted, where the combination of geographic factors created microclimates that remained habitable even as the broader region became hostile to human life. But survival in refugia came with its own costs. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to inbreeding depression, where genetic problems accumulate as the same individuals intermarry generation after generation. They're also vulnerable to what population geneticists call genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies that can reduce overall genetic diversity even in the absence of natural selection. More importantly for our bottleneck story, populations that become isolated from each other effectively stop contributing to each other's gene pools. Even if the total number of humans alive remained relatively high, if they were scattered into small, non-interacting groups, the effective population size, the number that matters for maintaining genetic diversity, would be much smaller than the census population. The classic climate explanation suggests that this combination of factors, severe environmental stress, population fragmentation, high local extinction rates, and reduced gene flow between surviving groups could account for the genetic signature of a severe, prolonged bottleneck. The 1,280 breeding individuals inferred from genomic data might represent not a literal count of all humans alive, but rather the effective breeding population of a species scattered into isolated refugia across Africa and possibly into southern Asia. This explanation has the virtue of simplicity and the weight of extensive climate evidence behind it. We know from ice cores, marine sediments, and other geological proxies that marine isotope stage 22 was indeed a period of extraordinary environmental stress. We know from modern studies that climate change can fragment populations and drive local extinctions. We know from theoretical population genetics that small, isolated populations behave genetically as if they were much smaller than their actual size. But as we'll see, the classic climate explanation may not tell the whole story. The genetic evidence suggests something more complex, more prolonged, and perhaps more interesting than a simple climate-driven population crash. The real mystery of the Great Bottleneck may lie not just in changing ice sheets and failing rains, but in the deeper dynamics of how small populations of early humans organized themselves socially and geographically across the African landscape. The climate story feels compelling until you examine the timeline more closely. A single glacial period, even one as severe as marine isotope stage 22, lasted perhaps 20,000 years. But the genetic signature suggests a bottleneck persisting for over 100,000 years, spanning multiple climate cycles, both glacial and interglacial periods. This creates a puzzle. If climate stress alone drove the bottleneck, we would expect the population to recover during warmer, wetter, interglacial periods when resources became more abundant. Instead, the genomic data suggests our ancestors remained at critically low effective population sizes for millennia after the worst climate conditions had passed. Something deeper was at work. Enter what we might call the structured Africa hypothesis. Rather than thinking of our ancestors as a single, large population that was temporarily squeezed by climate change, imagine them as a network of small, semi-isolated groups scattered across the African landscape. These groups might occasionally exchange individuals, a young adult leaving their birth group to find mates elsewhere, or small bands merging during particularly difficult periods, but most of the time, they remained genetically distinct. In such a structured population, even if the total number of people remained relatively high, the effective breeding population could be dramatically smaller than the census size. It's like having a dozen separate villages that rarely intermarry. Each village might be thriving, but genetically, they're acting almost like separate species. This structure could arise from geography, mountain ranges, deserts, and river systems that made long-distance travel difficult and dangerous. It could arise from cultural factors, territorial boundaries, linguistic differences, or social rules that discouraged intermarriage between groups. Or it could arise from simple logistics. In a world where travel was on foot and survival required intimate knowledge of local resources, there were strong incentives to stay close to familiar territory. Modern genetic analysis supports this interpretation. When researchers look at the distribution of genetic variants in contemporary African populations, they find patterns consistent with ancient population structure. Different regions show distinct genetic signatures, as if their ancestors had limited contact with each other for extended periods. The Fit-Cole method that revealed the bottleneck is sensitive to these structural effects. When populations are divided into small, partially isolated groups, the method tends to infer smaller, effective population sizes than would be estimated from a simple census count. This doesn't mean the method is wrong, it's accurately detecting the genetic consequences of population structure, but it does mean we need to be careful about how we interpret the results. The stronger view that emerges from this analysis is of compounding effects rather than a single cause. Yes, Climate change during marine isotope stage 22 created unprecedented stress. But this stress acted on a population that was already structured, already vulnerable to genetic drift and local extinctions. Consider the cascade of effects. Severe climate reduces carrying capacity across the landscape. Small, scattered groups become even more isolated as travel between safe areas becomes more difficult and dangerous. Some groups go locally extinct during the worst periods. Others survive, but with reduced numbers and increased inbreeding. Gene flow between surviving groups drops to near zero. Even when climate conditions improve, the structural factors that created isolation in the first place remain. Geographic barriers don't disappear when ice sheets melt. Cultural boundaries, once established, can persist for millennia. Small groups that have learned to survive in specific refugia may be reluctant to leave even when other areas become habitable again. This creates what population geneticists call a ratchet effect. Once effective population size drops below a certain threshold, it becomes difficult for it to recover quickly even when environmental conditions improve. Small populations are vulnerable to inbreeding depression, which reduces fitness and makes population growth slower. They're also vulnerable to additional demographic shocks, a bad hunting season, an outbreak of disease, or conflict with neighboring groups can push numbers down again just when recovery seems possible. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. Rather than showing a sharp crash followed by rapid recovery, the bottleneck signature suggests a gradual decline to very low levels, followed by an equally gradual recovery that took tens of thousands of years. This is the pattern we would expect from structural factors rather than a simple environmental crisis. Interestingly, the timing of recovery from the bottleneck coincides roughly with some major developments in human technology and behavior. The period around 700,000 years ago sees evidence of more systematic use of fire, more sophisticated tool-making techniques, and possibly the beginnings of symbolic behavior. It's tempting to speculate that these innovations helped our ancestors break out of the demographic trap they had fallen into. Fire, in particular, could have been transformative. Controlled use of fire extends the usable hours of each day, provides protection from predators, allows access to previously inedible foods through cooking, and creates a social focus for group activities. A band with reliable fire technology might be able to survive in habitats that would be impossible without it, effectively expanding the carrying capacity of the landscape. More sophisticated tools could have similar effects. Better hunting weapons increase success rates and reduce the risk of injury. Better food processing tools allow access to plant resources that would otherwise be too tough or toxic to eat. Better shelter construction provides protection from weather and predators. But perhaps most importantly, the gradual recovery from the bottleneck may reflect the evolution of social technologies, systems of cooperation, communication, and knowledge sharing that allowed small groups to function more effectively and maintain connections with each other across greater distances. The stronger view, then, sees the great bottleneck not as a simple climate crisis, but as a complex interaction between environmental stress, population structure, and the gradual evolution of the technologies and social systems that would eventually allow our species to break free from demographic constraints and begin the expansion that continues to this day. This interpretation suggests that the 1,280 effective breeding individuals represents not a literal count of human survivors, but rather the long-term consequence of living in small, scattered groups with limited gene flow between them. It's a more nuanced story than the classic climate explanation, but it's also a more hopeful one. Rather than barely surviving a single catastrophic period, our ancestors were slowly, persistently developing the innovations that would transform them from a collection of isolated bands into a connected, resilient species capable of colonizing the entire planet. The recovery from the bottleneck, when it finally came, was probably not the result of climate improvement alone. It was the result of cultural evolution, the gradual accumulation of knowledge, technology, and social practices that allowed human groups to maintain larger populations, travel greater distances, and stay connected across the landscape. The 1,280 became 2,500, then 5,000, then 10,000, and eventually the billions of us alive today. In this view, the Great Bottleneck was not just a near-extinction event that our species barely survived. It was the crucible in which we developed the essential characteristics that define us as a species: our unprecedented capacity for cultural innovation, our ability to cooperate in large groups, and our talent for adapting to almost any environment on Earth. The narrow passage through which all human genetics passed was also the birthplace of human civilization. Picture this: Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, 1 million years ago. Deep inside this limestone cavern, our ancestors kindled fires directly on the cave floor. The evidence remains today: layers of ash mixed with burned bone fragments, charcoal scattered through the sediments like ancient confetti. This isn't accidental fire, the result of lightning strikes or natural blazes. This is controlled combustion, fire as technology. The cave tells a story of intentional flame-making that spans hundreds of thousands of years. Layer after layer of archaeological deposits show the same pattern: hearths carefully maintained, ash cleared and redistributed, burned animal bones cracked open for marrow. These people didn't just use fire, they mastered it, turning combustion into a survival tool that extended daylight hours, provided protection from predators, and unlocked calories from foods that would otherwise be inedible. Picture this: the Levantine Corridor, that narrow bridge of land connecting Africa to the rest of the world. During glacial periods, when sea levels dropped and climate patterns shifted, this corridor became alternately a highway and a wall. When conditions were right, small bands of early humans could move between continents, carrying genes and ideas and technologies. When conditions turned harsh, the corridor closed, isolating populations on either side for thousands of years. The corridor's opening and closing acted like a genetic valve, controlling gene flow between populations. During open periods, isolated groups could reconnect, sharing genetic diversity and cultural innovations. During closed periods, populations diverged, developing distinct characteristics and facing different evolutionary pressures. This intermittent connectivity helps explain how our species could maintain some level of genetic diversity, even during periods of severe population restriction. Picture this: the shores of ancient Lake Makgadikgadi in what is now Botswana. 200,000 years ago, this was one of the largest lakes in Africa, a vast inland sea surrounded by wetlands that supported enormous populations of fish, waterbirds, and large mammals. Archaeological evidence suggests our ancestors lived along these shores for tens of thousands of years, developing specialized tools for fishing and food processing. But the lake was vulnerable to climate change. As rainfall patterns shifted during glacial cycles, the lake periodically shrank to a fraction of its former size, forcing human populations into smaller and smaller refugia around the remaining water sources. When the lake dried up completely, as it did multiple times during the Pleistocene, entire regional populations may have been forced to migrate or face extinction. Picture this: the Gesher Beno Yaakov site in Israel, 780,000 years ago. Here, our ancestors cooked fish over controlled fires, processed nuts and seeds with specialized stone tools, and maintained what archaeologists call a plant food processing toolkit. The diversity of foods in their diet is extraordinary: aquatic resources, terrestrial game, nuts, seeds, fruits, underground storage organs. This dietary flexibility was crucial for survival during unstable climate periods. When one food source failed, there were others to fall back on. When seasonal availability changed, the toolkit allowed adaptation to new resources. The site represents not just technological sophistication, but ecological wisdom, the kind of deep knowledge of local environments that allows small populations to extract maximum nutrition from minimal resources. Picture this: the obsidian trade networks revealed at sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya, 320,000 years ago. Volcanic glass tools found at the site came from sources dozens of kilometers away, carried across the landscape by early humans who understood the superior qualities of obsidian for tool-making. This represents something unprecedented: long-distance exchange networks that connected distant populations. These networks weren't just economic, they were lifelines. Groups that participated in trade networks were less vulnerable to local resource failures. They had access to superior raw materials for tools. Most importantly, trade networks maintained social connections between groups, facilitating the exchange of individuals that prevented inbreeding in small populations and maintained genetic diversity across the landscape. Picture this: the magnetic reversal preserved in volcanic rocks around the world, 770–2000 years ago. The Matuyama-Brunhes reversal, when Earth's magnetic field flipped its polarity, provides a precise timeline marker that helps scientists coordinate archaeological sites with climate records and genetic analyses. This reversal occurs right near the end of the inferred genetic bottleneck, offering a kind of geological punctuation mark for this crucial period in human evolution. The timing is more than coincidental. Magnetic reversals, while they don't directly affect climate, can temporarily weaken Earth's magnetic field, allowing increased cosmic radiation to reach the surface. Some researchers have speculated this could affect atmospheric chemistry and climate patterns, adding another layer of environmental stress during an already challenging period. Picture this: the stone tool assemblages from Isenya in Kenya, 900,000 years ago. The site contains hundreds of Acheulean handaxes, each one shaped with careful attention to symmetry and proportion. These tools represent something extraordinary in the animal kingdom: standardized technology passed down through generations with remarkable consistency. The ability to maintain technological traditions over hundreds of thousands of years speaks to sophisticated systems of teaching and learning. Parents showed children not just how to make tools, but how to think about tool making, understanding the properties of different stones, visualizing the end product, planning the sequence of strikes needed to achieve the desired shape. This cultural transmission was itself a survival technology, ensuring that hard-won knowledge wasn't lost when individual experts died. Picture this: the coastlines of southern Africa during the last interglacial period, 125,000 years ago. While this is later than our bottleneck period, it provides a model for how coastal resources could have supported human populations during earlier interglacial periods. Shell middens at sites like Pinnacle Point show intensive exploitation of marine resources: shellfish, fish, seaweeds, and other coastal foods that provided reliable, high-quality nutrition. Coastal environments may have served as refugia during the worst periods of the bottleneck. Even when inland areas became too arid to support human populations, coastlines remained productive. The combination of marine resources, fresh water from rivers, and terrestrial foods from coastal vegetation could support small but stable populations through extended periods of climate stress. The 1,280 who saved humanity didn't survive through heroic individual efforts or sudden evolutionary leaps. They survived through the patient accumulation of small advantages, the gradual development of what we might call humanity's first survival toolkit. Each element of this toolkit was simple enough that any individual could master it, but together they created a synergy that allowed our species to persist where others failed. Fire was the foundation technology. Not just the ability to make fire, but the knowledge of how to maintain it, feed it, bank it for the night, and rekindle it from embers. Archaeological evidence from sites like Wonderwork Cave shows our ancestors using fire consistently by 1 million years ago, right around the beginning of the bottleneck period. Fire provided warmth during cold nights, protection from predators, light for working after dark, and most importantly, the ability to cook food. Cooking transformed human nutrition in ways that are still not fully appreciated. Raw tubers, tough and often toxic, became soft and safe when heated. Meat became more digestible and safer to eat. Seeds and nuts yielded more calories per unit of digestive energy expended. Even more crucial, cooking allowed access to foods that would otherwise be completely inedible: bitter roots, toxic leaves, tough plant fibers that could be rendered into nutritious meals through careful application of heat and time. But fire technology wasn't just about the flames themselves. It required a deep understanding of combustible materials, which woods burned hot and clean, which grasses made good tinder, how to maintain the right balance of fuel and air to keep fires burning without smoking. It required social coordination, with different individuals taking responsibility for gathering fuel, tending flames, and maintaining ember beds. Fire created the first human technology that demanded cooperation across the entire group. Tool-making represented the second pillar of the survival toolkit. The Acheulean handaxes found at sites across Africa and into Asia represent one of humanity's first standardized technologies, tools made to consistent patterns across hundreds of thousands of years and millions of square kilometers. This consistency points to sophisticated systems of teaching and learning that allowed crucial knowledge to pass reliably from generation to generation, but the tools themselves were only part of the story. More important was the cognitive framework that tool-making represented, the ability to visualize a finished product, plan a sequence of actions to achieve it, and maintain focus through the dozens or hundreds of precise strikes needed to shape stone into functional implements. Tool-making was problem-solving made visible, a form of applied intelligence that could be taught, practiced, and improved over time. Dietary flexibility formed the third element of the toolkit. Evidence from sites like Gesher Beno Yaakov shows our ancestors exploiting an extraordinary range of food sources: large game, small animals, fish, shellfish, nuts, seeds, fruits, tubers, leaves, and bark. This dietary breadth wasn't just opportunistic scavenging, it represented systematic knowledge of seasonal availability, processing techniques, and nutritional complementarity. When one food source failed, there were others to fall back on. When climate conditions changed the availability of traditional foods, the knowledge base existed to identify and exploit new resources. This flexibility was especially crucial during the bottleneck period, when climate instability made it impossible to rely on any single food source for extended periods. Social cooperation formed the invisible foundation that made everything else possible. Archaeological evidence suggests our ancestors lived in small groups of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, large enough to provide mutual support and maintain genetic diversity, small enough to move quickly and make decisions collectively. These groups practiced what anthropologists call cooperative breeding, where multiple adults helped care for children, reducing the burden on individual parents and increasing child survival rates. Cooperation extended to food sharing, with successful hunters distributing meat to the entire group rather than consuming it individually. This sharing reduced the variance in individual nutrition, the difference between feast and famine that could determine survival in harsh environments. It also created social bonds that helped groups stay together during difficult periods when the temptation to fragment might otherwise prove overwhelming. Information sharing was perhaps the most crucial form of cooperation. Knowledge of water sources, animal migration patterns, plant phenology, weather signs, and safe travel routes was too valuable to hoard. Groups that developed systems for sharing and preserving information had enormous advantages over those that relied on individual memory and experience alone. The development of early forms of language, while difficult to trace archaeologically, was probably crucial during this period. The ability to communicate precise information about distant resources, past events, and future plans allowed small groups to coordinate activities across space and time in ways that would have been impossible through gesture and demonstration alone. Mobility strategies formed another crucial element of the toolkit. Rather than defending fixed territories, many groups probably practiced what archaeologists call residential mobility, moving camps seasonally or in response to resource availability. This mobility allowed groups to track shifting resource distributions and avoid areas where competition or conflict made life dangerous. But mobility was constrained by the need to maintain social networks. Groups couldn't simply wander randomly across the landscape. They needed to maintain contact with relatives and allies, honor territorial agreements with neighbors, and coordinate movements to avoid dangerous overcrowding at crucial resource locations like permanent water sources. Population management, while it sounds modern, was probably practiced in various forms by our ancestors. Small groups living at the margins of survival couldn't support unlimited population growth. Archaeological evidence suggests various mechanisms for regulating group size: delayed marriage, extended nursing periods that reduced female fertility, and probably forms of infanticide when resources were insufficient to support additional children. These practices, harsh as they seem to modern sensibilities, may have been essential for group survival during the worst periods of the bottleneck. Groups that grew too large for their resource base faced the choice between fissioning, splitting into smaller units that might not be viable independently, or experiencing catastrophic mortality that could lead to complete group extinction. The survival toolkit that emerged during the bottleneck period wasn't just a collection of technologies and practices. It was an integrated system that allowed small groups of humans to extract maximum survival value from minimal resources while maintaining the social cohesion and genetic diversity necessary for long-term persistence. It was humanity's first comprehensive strategy for living in an uncertain world, and its basic elements remain recognizable in human societies today. The story of the 1,280 survivors isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting both our fragility and our resilience as a species, offering lessons that feel startlingly relevant in our current moment of global uncertainty and rapid change. Consider first what the bottleneck reveals about human kinship. Every person alive today, from the Arctic to the Amazon, from Manhattan to rural Mongolia, descends from that narrow genetic passage 900,000 years ago. The differences we see between populations, the variations in skin color and facial features and body proportions that have sometimes been used to justify division and conflict, all developed after that shared bottleneck. Genetically speaking, humans are an unusually homogeneous species, more similar to each other than most animals are to members of their own populations. This isn't just an abstract scientific finding, it's a truth that challenges some of our deepest assumptions about human differences. The tribal conflicts that fill our news cycles, the ethnic tensions that drive wars and genocide, the racial hierarchies that persist in societies around the world, all of these rest on perceived differences that are genetically trivial compared to our shared inheritance from those 1,280 survivors. But the bottleneck story offers more than just a lesson in human unity. It provides a case study in how small populations survive existential challenges through cooperation, innovation, and adaptation. The survival toolkit that carried our ancestors through the bottleneck, dietary flexibility, technological innovation, social cooperation, information sharing, reads like a playbook for resilience that remains relevant today. Take dietary flexibility. Our ancestors survived by exploiting diverse food sources, never becoming too dependent on any single resource. Modern food systems, by contrast, have become increasingly specialized and globalized, creating efficiencies but also vulnerabilities. A handful of crop species now provide the majority of human calories worldwide. Climate change, disease outbreaks, or geopolitical conflicts that disrupt these crops could create food security crises affecting billions of people. The bottleneck survivors approach suggests alternative strategies, maintaining diverse food systems, preserving traditional crop varieties, supporting local food production, and developing technologies that allow rapid adaptation to changing environmental conditions. It's not about returning to hunter-gatherer lifestyles, but about building flexibility into systems that have become dangerously rigid. Fire technology during the bottleneck provided energy independence, the ability to generate heat, light, and cooked food independent of environmental conditions. Today's energy systems, while vastly more powerful, often create similar dependencies. Societies that rely heavily on fossil fuel imports or centralized electrical grids can face catastrophic vulnerabilities when supply chains are disrupted or infrastructure fails. The renewable energy transition happening across the globe echoes the fire revolution of 900,000 years ago. developing distributed technologies that provide energy security while reducing dependence on scarce or environmentally damaging resources. Solar panels and wind turbines aren't the same as controlled fire, but they serve similar functions, providing energy independence that enhances resilience in uncertain times. Social cooperation was perhaps the most crucial element of the bottleneck survival toolkit. Small groups facing existential threats couldn't afford internal conflict or free riding. Resources had to be shared, information had to be exchanged, and decisions had to be made collectively. Modern societies face similar imperatives on a global scale. Climate change, pandemic disease, economic instability, and technological disruption are challenges that transcend national boundaries. No country can solve these problems alone, just as no individual group could have survived the bottleneck in isolation. The cooperation that saved humanity 900,000 years ago needs to be scaled up to species-level cooperation if we're going to navigate the challenges of the 21st century successfully. The bottleneck also offers perspective on the relationship between crisis and innovation. The period of demographic contraction coincided with some of the most important technological developments in human history: systematic fire use, sophisticated tool-making, early forms of symbolic communication. Crisis didn't just threaten our ancestors, it catalyzed innovations that transformed them. Contemporary crises, from climate change to artificial intelligence to biotechnology, carry similar potential for transformative innovation. The question is whether we can harness that potential constructively, or whether we'll be overwhelmed by changes happening too rapidly for social and political systems to adapt. Information preservation and transmission were crucial during the bottleneck. Small groups couldn't afford to lose hard-won knowledge about survival techniques, resource locations, or social relationships. Today, we face the opposite problem: information overload in a world where knowledge becomes obsolete rapidly and misinformation spreads as quickly as facts. The bottleneck experience suggests the importance of developing better systems for preserving and transmitting crucial knowledge, not just technical information, but wisdom about cooperation, resilience, and adaptation that our species has accumulated over millennia of surviving in uncertain environments. Perhaps most importantly, the bottleneck story offers perspective on timescales. The demographic contraction lasted over 100,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history. Recovery, when it came, was gradual, taking tens of thousands of years to restore genetic diversity and population growth. This perspective is humbling for a species that often thinks in terms of quarterly profits and election cycles. The challenges we face today, climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality, technological disruption, are playing out over similar timescales. Solutions will require patience, persistence, and the kind of long-term thinking that allowed our ancestors to maintain cultural traditions across dozens of millennia. The 1,280 survivors who saved humanity didn't know they were saving humanity. They were simply trying to make it through another day, another season, another generation. They succeeded not through heroic gestures but through small acts of competence and care repeated countless times across centuries. Their legacy isn't just genetic, it's cultural. The capacity for cooperation, innovation, and persistence that carried them through the bottleneck is part of our inheritance as human beings. In moments when the future seems uncertain and the challenges seem overwhelming, we can remember that we are the descendants of people who faced even greater challenges and found ways to keep going. The fires they kept burning became the cities that glow from orbit today. The tools they shaped became the technologies that connect us across continents. The children they protected and taught became the ancestors of every scientist, artist, and storyteller who has ever lived. We are their wildest dreams made real, carrying forward the flame they refused to let die. Look up at the night sky for a moment. Every star you see has been burning for millions or billions of years, casting light across distances so vast that the photons touching your eyes tonight began their journey long before Earth existed. But none of those stars know you're watching. None of them chose to keep burning for your sake. 900,000 years ago, in the darkness of an ice age that lasted longer than all of recorded history, a small group of humans made a different kind of choice. They chose to keep their fires burning not just for themselves, but for children not yet born, for futures they couldn't imagine, for a species that didn't yet know it was a species worth saving. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, you are the proof that they succeeded. Every breath you take, every thought that drifts through your mind, every moment of comfort and safety you experience, it all traces back through an unbroken chain of survival stretching across nearly 1,000,000 years. Every one of your ancestors, generation after generation, lived long enough to reproduce. They survived famines and floods, predators and plagues, ice ages, and volcanic winters. They passed down not just their genes but their accumulated wisdom about how to live in an uncertain world. The number 1280 might shift as new research refines our understanding of the bottleneck. The exact timeline might be adjusted as better dating methods are developed. The specific mechanisms that cause the demographic contraction will continue to be debated in scientific journals and conference halls. But the essential truth will remain: our species passed through an extraordinary narrowing that left permanent signatures in our DNA and our culture. We are all products of that passage. The capacity for cooperation that got our ancestors through their darkest hours lives on in every act of kindness, every shared meal, every hand extended to help someone in need. The innovation that allowed them to develop fire and tools and language continues in every problem solved, every new technology developed, every creative solution to challenges that seemed impossible. The persistence that kept them going through 100,000 years of demographic winter echoes in every human who has ever faced difficulty and chosen to keep trying. Every student who struggles through a difficult subject, every artist who continues creating despite rejection, every parent who works multiple jobs to provide for their children, every activist who keeps fighting for justice despite setbacks, they are all carrying forward the spirit of the 1280 who refused to surrender to extinction. If you're listening to this as you drift towards sleep, let yourself feel the connection stretching back through time. You are not alone in the darkness. You never have been. You are part of a story that began when our species learned to keep fires burning through the longest nights. When small groups of humans discovered that sharing resources and knowledge and care was not just morally good, but essential for survival. The challenges we face today, climate change, social division, technological disruption, economic uncertainty, are real and significant. But they are not unprecedented. Our ancestors faced challenges that were, in many ways, far more severe. They survived not because they were perfect or heroic, but because they were adaptable, cooperative, and persistent, because they refused to give up hope, even when hope seemed unreasonable. We have inherited their capacity for resilience. More than that, we have tools they could never have imagined. We can communicate instantly across continents. We can share knowledge with millions of people simultaneously. We can coordinate responses to global challenges in ways that would have seemed like magic to those 1,280 survivors gathering around their small fires. But the most important tools we've inherited from them are not technological. They are social and psychological. The ability to care for people beyond our immediate family, to make sacrifices for future generations, to find meaning and purpose in the work of keeping the human story going. If this story has moved you, if it's helped you see your place in the long arc of human history, consider sharing it with someone else. Not because you need to spread a message, but because sharing stories is one of the oldest human technologies. Around fires 900,000 years ago, our ancestors told each other stories about where they had been, what they had learned, how they had survived another day in a dangerous world. Your voice, sharing this story, becomes part of that tradition. Your listening right now connects you to every human who has ever gazed into flames and wondered about the future, who has ever looked at their children and hoped for a better world, who has ever chosen cooperation over competition, patience over haste, hope over despair. Tell someone where you're listening from tonight. Toronto, where snow is falling outside your window. Sydney, where morning sun is painting the harbour gold. London, where evening settles over centuries-old streets. Wherever you are, you're part of the global conversation that began when our species first developed language, first started sharing complex information about how to survive and thrive in an uncertain world. The 1280 who saved humanity didn't save it once and for all. They saved it for their time, and then passed the responsibility to the next generation, who passed it to the next, who passed it to the next, in an unbroken chain that leads directly to us. Now it's our turn to keep the fires burning, to make the choices that will determine whether the human story continues for another million years. You don't have to save the world tomorrow. You don't have to solve all the problems or answer all the questions. You just have to do what your ancestors did. Wake up each day and choose to keep going, to care for the people around you, to share what you know, to be a little kinder than you have to be, to keep the flame of human curiosity and compassion alive for one more generation. Rest now, let your breath slow down and your muscles relax. Feel the comfort of your warm bed, your safe shelter, your connected world. Feel gratitude for the 1280 who made all of this possible, and for the countless generations who carried their legacy forward to this moment. Tomorrow, when you wake, you'll be carrying that legacy a little further into the future. You'll be part of the human story that refuses to end, the conversation that began around fires in the darkness and continues in bedrooms and coffee shops and classrooms around the world. The story kept going because we did, and because you will. Good night.